Hey everybody, welcome back to On Stage, Off Stage. I am your host, George Sapio, and this is episode number 188, March of 2025. Our guest this month is Svetlana Arestova. She is a literary translator and professor of translation at HSE University in Moscow, Russia. Her list of accomplishments is extensive, including translations of books by Andrew Sean Greer, Daniel Mason, and Elizabeth Strout. Svetlana was looking for play scripts to use as translation projects for her students and chose two of mine, Oatmeal and a Cigarette and Fault Lines. I now possess scripts of those two plays in Cyrillic and have videos of the plays done in Russian, which, when you're stripped of the English words, you're stripped of the actual plot. But you get to hear the other important factors of the script, such as variations in tempo, emotional rises and falls, and length and sequencing of the beats. It was a very revealing experience, and I was thrilled when Svetlana agreed to be on the podcast. Let's talk about the actual art of translation, because it's not just a simple transposition of one word for another. Languages differ like crazy, and an idea in one language will not translate to a concept in a different one. So when it comes to an assignment in translation, what do you have to go through to make sure that not only are the words correct, but the actual intent is correct?
For me, translation is an art form. I am a literary translator. I work with fiction. And for me, translation is like acting, actually, because you have to live the text. And it's also a little like playing dolls, because when you're playing with Barbie dolls, you're kind of holding them and voicing them, and you're directing at the same time you're speaking for them. But of course, a translator is a kind of transmitter. We don't make things up. We express other people's ideas. Sometimes translators have to use different strategies. If we're dealing with a foreign concept that is unfamiliar to a Russian audience, or if we're dealing with culture-specific stuff like realia, we'll have to use a domestication or foreignization strategy. A foreignization strategy is when you take the reader and you pull them towards the author, towards the other country. So it's when you don't change the realia of a different country to your own.
When you say realia, what do you mean by that?
I mean a culture-specific notion, idea, or object. Food or clothes can be realia. You know, like blini, the Russian pancakes.
Oh, yes,
It's an example of a realia. And domestication is when you use a familiar object or notion instead of the foreign one. That's sometimes used as well, especially in children's books, sometimes also in drama. So children's literature and drama are more prone to changes and different interpretations. That's where translators kind of deviate from the original more, because the material helps it.
Children's books. Now, that's a concept I hadn't even considered, but of course, why not? Children don't have that experience of having too many years on the planet. There's not enough information has infiltrated into their brains to set them on one particular mindset or one particular view of the concepts of the world around them. How do you approach a children's book when you're going from, let's say, English to Russian? I mean, because there will be different concepts. So let's talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a great topic. I love it. Children's books are interesting because they have illustrations, and illustrations are really helpful if you want to explain something to a child. So they come across a new word and they see it illustrated on the page. So that's helpful. Plus, modern children have the internet, they watch foreign TV shows. So a lot of the concepts are already familiar to them, like avocados. Soviet children did not know about avocados. Now I think the generational gap is bigger than the intercultural gap. So today's children might not know about objects that their grandmothers used when they went
Oh,
to
yeah.
school, but they might know about objects that children in Britain or the USA are using. Yeah, also, children's books are not meant to be oversimplified. Nothing in translation should be simplified, because if the author means for something to be difficult, well, you should not try to explain it, chew it for the reader. Children can ask their parents. Because some books are meant to be read together with a
Yeah.
parent, and children love playing with difficult words. They love mispronouncing them and using them in, every possible way when it's necessary and unnecessary. So there's nothing wrong with a bit of a challenge in children's books.
Kids, yeah, will play with words and they will mash them around because everything to them is a learning experience. Have you done a lot of children's books?
Not many. I mainly translate prose for grown-ups, but I did translate a couple of short stories by an early 20th century author. They belong to the genre schoolgirl story. So in Great Britain, school prose, is really important. It's where Harry Potter came from. They had schoolboy prose in the Victorian times. It was published in magazines. So boys would buy those magazines and read stories about schoolboys. And then at the end of the 19th century, actually at the beginning of the 20th century, schoolgirl prose appeared. And it was forward-looking. So things were happening in those books that were not yet happening in real life. Like, it was more feministic, I guess, because the Victorian heroine is kind of inactive. She's a little angel, and she can suffer, but she can't go to adventures. And in those schoolgirl stories by 20th century, girls had a lot of adventures. They went to private schools and they saved each other from fires, from thunderstorms, from pirates, and so on. Yeah, and they had their own slang, like any subculture. Those schoolgirls had slang. They
Right.
called each other chums or bricks. You're a brick. It means like you're a good person or a cool girl. Yeah, that was
Nice.
a really interesting experience, finding ways to translate the slang.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because it's not, I know from trying to learn Spanish, which has been a little difficult for me. We speak rapidly, so people don't understand us when they're trying to learn something. We use a lot of slang. We use terms that nobody else uses. How do you deal with slang? Because you must come across that fairly often.
Yeah, slang is a challenge because if you use slang from your own country, it could be marked, meaning it could be associated with a certain time period or a certain group of people. And
Hmm.
when the reader reads that slang in translation, the wrong image comes into their head. A good idea is to use slang that is more or less neutral or timeless, or just colloquial phrases. It was a challenge when I was translating that schoolgirl story. I tried to look at schoolgirl stories in Russian. We had a couple of authors at the turn of the 20th century who went to school and wrote books or wrote diaries about that. And their slang was all wrong. It didn't fit the British schoolgirl story. It was kind of lyrical, I don't know, just it created the wrong atmosphere.
Okay.
I,
Yeah.
I tried to look at the translations of 1920s or so writers like Evelyn Waugh or the Jeeves and Wooster books, where the golden youth uses slang. And it was a little bit helpful, but in the end, we kind of used like colloquial phrases, and we, I think, came up with a word. The Russian language has a lot of morphological capabilities.
Yes. Yeah.
We have a lot of suffixes, prefixes. We could make a lot of new words just morphologically.
Right.
And
Well,
that's,
dealing with names is always a challenge in Russian because you have so many diminutives and so many variations on one name. And
Yeah,
sometimes, yeah, it's very hard to keep track of who you're speaking of.
my name has a pun in it. So my name Svetlana, it's connected with the adjective svetly, which is light, like
Hmm.
light shining or sunlight.
Yeah.
And the short form is Sveta. And if somebody calls me, they say Svet, and it's the same as light. And my mom always laughs when she says something like Svet, turn on the lights, because it sounds Svet, включи свет.
Yep.
She finds it hilarious.
Nice to have wordplay like that, though. Keeps the language interesting. Let me go back a little bit here. Your English is spectacular, by the way. Where did you learn it?
Thanks for the compliment, but when I do public speaking, something happens to my accent. It starts, going haywire, going crazy. I
How
usually,
so?
the YouTubers that I watch just start coming up, and they've got different accents, and I start imitating the most recent watch.
So you
So I,
you okay, so you pick up tonal varieties. You're a mimic. You pick up tonal varieties from people you hear speaking around you.
yeah, and at school we always study British English. So it's been ingrained in me. That's why, it sounds more like British than American, because that's where we had Oxford and Cambridge textbooks and audio cassettes.
What are some of the biggest problems you've had trying to decide between how to translate a sentence or a word?
For some authors, keeping close to the original is really important,
Yeah,
because every word is chosen with care, and they have specific rhythmic patterns that you want to preserve or kind of preserve.
yes.
When we're translating drama or dialogue, we tend to deviate more from the original, because it's more like spoken language,
Yeah,
and translating it word for word just would not do the job. The languages are different. A dialogue is a kind of back and forth between people, and in prose and in drama, authors try to make it coherent, and they
hmm,
use specific techniques like little reactions, like okay, well, or addressing somebody by name. So in English, you put the name at the end of the sentence usually,
yeah.
and in Russian, it sounds unnatural. So we should either start with the name or omit it altogether. And actually, statistically, in the Russian language, people in Russian literature, names are used less often in dialects. So it
Okay.
would be natural to omit the name some of the time. And the linkers that are used in English sometimes won't work in Russian. So when you're translating a dialogue, you have to make sure that the final text is coherent, regardless of what's in the original. Those little building blocks, the linkers, the reactions, the exclamations will be different a lot of the time.
So, as long as we mentioned drama, let's talk about the work you did on my plays. I gave you two plays of mine to work on, Oatmeal and a Cigarette and Fault Lines. First question, how difficult were they to translate? Because you gave them to your students to do the work.
Well,
Uh-oh.
close. No, I supervised them, and
Well, of course,
obviously
yes.
led the discussions during the lessons and did the editing. But they did all the translation work. It was a lot of fun
I hope
because
so.
we could role play the dialogues during the lessons. That made me a kind of a popular teacher. It was difficult because so many translators were working on one text. So we had Team Oatmeal, which was 4 students,
Hmm.
and 3 of them were really chummy and on the same wavelength.
Yes.
And they worked together closely, and they were really self-sufficient. The 4th person joined a little bit later, but they also, you know, worked really well. So Oatmeal and a Cigarette was easy for me. But Fault Lines, we had 6 people on Team Fault Lines, and some of them have different translation styles and
Sure.
interpreted the characters differently. Although we did have discussions about the characters, we analyzed them together, but still, two people can't translate the same text
The same way.
identically.
Just to interrupt you for a second, because there are probably a few people out there in the audience that haven't read both of my plays. Oatmeal and a Cigarette deals with two people. One is the mother, one is the child. But the child is 30 years old. He sleeps in a crib. He wears diapers. He behaves exactly like a 3-year-old. And his mother, and I'm using air quotes here, is his older brother. And there is a babysitter, and she comes into this as well. So this is not your typical family situation. Fault Lines, on the other hand, concerns three sisters, one husband, and their mother, who has been dead for a number of years, and yet the mother still actually comes in a little bit of magical realism. So between the first atypical setup of the 30-year-old pretending he's a 3-year-old and going along with this willingly, and the second one where the mother appears in, let's say, ghost form in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
how difficult was it to get those particular concepts across to your students and have them work with that?
Oatmeal and a Cigarette was not difficult because they have standard roles. Like you said, Claire, who is the elder brother, is a
Right,
mummy, and Billy, the younger brother, is mummy's the son.
right.
So they adhered to those stereotypes. The fact that they were stereotypical in some way helped
Hmm.
us, and we saw that Claire used a lot of mum language, like I'll wash your mouth with soap.
Right.
And we've all been there. We've got those phrases or similar phrases in Russian as well. And we had a lot of fun remembering what our parents and teachers told us. And we sprinkled those in the text.
How do you
So
say
when
I'll
you...
wash your mouth out with soap in Russian?
Я вымою тебе рот с мылом.
I thought so.
So when you're translating something, you're working on the level of the whole text. And
Right,
if you see specific features like Claire using those phrases or Claire using idioms, so his language is quite idiomatic. You insert those, sometimes in the same place if you can, but
right,
sometimes you can't. There's no equivalent phrase. You could use this technique elsewhere, and this is called compensation. So you preserve the technique on the level of the whole text. We've already mentioned diminutives. Claire
right. Yeah,
uses diminutives. When he talks to Billy, he talks to him like you would talk to a child. We use diminutives more than you did because if Claire spoke Russian, he would be using them more because there are more possibilities for that. So that was
right.
fun. And Billy speaks like a child. So we used, children's language.
Sure.
He could mispronounce something, use diminutives sometimes as well, or he'll say something like, I made a poopy, and we would have a lot of fun with that. Jane was the most difficult of the three, Jane, the
Really?
babysitter, because
Wow.
she
Okay.
was, not as bright. Her speech portrait was not as distinguishing. She was more normal. And we had to think, well, she's not old-fashioned like Claire, so let's make sure we don't make her sound old-fashioned. She
Hmm.
could use words like, cool or something
Yeah.
Claire wouldn't use. She goes to university, so she's educated, and she doesn't mollycoddle Billy, so she doesn't really use a lot of diminutives or,
Right.
baby language. That's how we drafted her portrait. Well, drafted, kind of analyzed it.
Sure.
With the three sisters, actually, a lot of people call fault lines the three sisters. With the three sisters, we cast characters that could potentially play the three sisters. We had a game like that.
Right.
And we imagined what musical instrument each sister would be. Teresa, who is the eldest sister, she would be a tube, for example, because we imagined that she had a low voice and she had gravity and weight. And Ginger, the middle sister, would be a guitar, for example, because there was
Okay.
something like hippie about her. She's into psychology and stuff. And the third sister, Stasi, she's neurotic, so she'd be a fiddle. And she sometimes speaks quickly. So the sisters speak in different tempos. Teresa the slowest, Stasi the quickest, and we had to pick up on that. And the funny thing, when we had a reading of the play, so my friend works at another university, and she has an amateur drama club there. Her students read your plays, excerpts from your plays. We had a reading at an art residency where I met Katya Wagner. And when I heard Stasi speaking, so the actress who read for Stasi, I nearly exploded with joy because she has the squeakiest voice ever. And squeaky it fits Stasi really well. She, that girl, she spoke like a rubber duck being squeezed.
That's funny
The
because the
effect,
first actor I had who played Stasi, an amazing actor, she's now a doctor, has a very high, light voice that when she gets excited, it goes up almost another octave, at least a few notes on the scale. So that to me just fit the character perfectly.
yeah, like magic. Well, it means that we read the text correctly.
You did. It always interested me to see what a script would translate to in a different culture, different language. And I wish I knew Russian well enough to be able to appreciate all the work you did on it, because just from talking to you now, I've already learned a few things about my own scripts, which is absolutely invaluable. And I think from now on, I'm probably going to look at my characters as musical instruments. The neurotic ones will always be fiddles, and the bossy ones will always be tubas. And I'll probably branch out from that. So you're working with your students. How many students
Yeah.
do you have?
Well, the group that worked on your place, it had 10 students last year. This year we have fewer students. 2 of them left. 2 of them were, what do you call students who are not officially in your group, but who just
Right.
attend the classes?
Auditing. We call it auditing.
Auditing.
Audit. They're there, but they're not getting credit, but they're still participating.
Yeah. So this year there are 6 of them left. And this year each of them will be translating a full-length novel. So your plays were kind of preparing them for that. Well, they'll be translating something. We've got different publishers interested in our students. We try to find them jobs and connect them to publishers while they're still with us.
How is the training you're giving your students different from the training that you got when you became a translator? What kind of training did you have in the first place?
After finishing school, I entered Lomonosov Moscow State University. I think it's like the most well-known university to foreigners.
Okay.
If you're thinking about Russian universities, I guess that's what comes to mind. I studied at the philological faculty. My specialization was theory and practice of translation. After graduation, after a couple of years of, doing different translation-related jobs, I became a literary translator. I attended a seminar at my faculty. I was an auditor, right? Did I use it correctly?
You did, yes.
At a literary translation seminar. So where I met my mentor, who is a huge figure in education and literary translation. So her name is Alexandra Borisenko. I attended the seminar, and she helped me get my first book. So she connected me with the publisher.
Nice.
I work at a different university now. We both work there. And we have, a whole master's program dedicated to literary translation only. So that's 2 years of literary translation education. So my students are getting more than I was, and their entry into the profession is going to be smoother and less stressful, I hope.
Yeah, I was just listening to you speak, and I can hear the British influence in some of the syllables that you're using. It definitely comes through. What are you working on now?
I'm translating a novel by Alice McDermott. She's an American author.
Right.
Teaching takes up a lot of my time. I
Right.
also teach at creative writing courses. I teach translation there as well. So that takes up a lot of time and energy. I can have writing blocks, or I guess you'd say translation blocks.
Sure.
when I'm not in the mood, I don't have inspiration, I'm too tired. That's why the process is going slowly. But the novel is really interesting. It's about Vietnam.
Okay.
So the years before the Vietnam War was in full swing, the novel takes place in 1953, and it's about the wives of American engineers, and sometimes, spies or agents who worked in Vietnam. Those wives had garden parties, and they had to come up with activities to fill their days. And it's really weird because most novels about Vietnam are about the fighting and the heroism. And this novel is about those women and the symbol of the novel is a Barbie doll. Those women decide to make clothes for Barbie dolls and give them as gifts to Vietnamese orphans. So that's their little charity project.
Gives you a perspective on something you would have never thought of. What?
That's an unusual take.
Yeah, it is a very unusual take. Svetlana, this has been so much fun talking to you. I am really, really glad we were able to meet you in Moscow and me in Costa Rica. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for letting us translate your plays and for being so much fun to talk to. And we've been inside your head a little bit, I guess, as we were translating the plays, and it's a fun place to be.
I'm going to take that compliment all the way to with me. Most people run screaming in the other direction. Thank you very much for the compliment, and good luck.
Thanks. Good luck to you.
Hey kids, thanks for listening to On Stage, Off Stage. On Stage, Off Stage is produced monthly, and all of our shows can be found at onstageoffstage.org and also on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoy what we do, please recommend us to your friends. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at OnOffStage. And if you are a theater artist with an upcoming project or interest, or know of someone in the theater world who'd make good chat, by all means, send us a note at onstageoffstagepodcast@gmail.com. Our theme music is Don't Worry, Be Frappy by the composer Max Dickinson. You can find a lot more of Max's magnificent music on SoundCloud. I'm George Sapio. Thanks once again for listening, and please be kind to those with whom we share this rock. And as always, happy theatering to all of you.